It engages in politics. It engages in the politics as an institution by way of methodically accessing, searching, and critiquing the archive, spatial concerns of materialism, technology, re-appropriation, erasures, identity, intersectionality, and representation are some of the drivers in the studio. In that context, the Palimpsestic Histories Lecture Series brings historians who are investigating similar questions as part of their scholarship. We are thrilled and honored to have Dr. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones deliver the inaugural lecture of the series. Any reference to Lucknow history is incomplete without a reference to Rosie's scholarship. The vastness of her exhaustive work is almost an institution in itself. Dr. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones studied Urdu and Hindi at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Her doctoral work there was published in 1985 as A Fatal Friendship, the Nawabs, the British, and the City of Lucknow. It is an influential piece of writing on Lucknow history. Since then, she has written a number of books, such as a trilogy on Major General Claude Martin, founder of Marmot's College in India and France. She is also an honorary Old Martinian. Other books include Murshidabad, Forgotten Capital of Bengal with Dr. Neeta Das, and Portraits in Princely India. Her biography of Nawab Wajid Ali Shah, the last king in India, published in 2014, was a critical success in Britain and India, and a Bollywood director has recently proposed a film based on the book. She has just completed a book for the new HarperCollins India series on India's historic battles, Lucknow 1857, to be published later this year, and is one of the very few female military historians to examine the uprising. Rosie has published numerous articles and chapters on colonial India, including catalogues for exhibitions at major London galleries. She lectures at the Victoria and Albert Museum, London, on the Asian Arts course and for the Indian Arts Circle in London. She is also the editor of Chaukidar, the journal of the British Association for Cemeteries in South Asia, which records and restores British graves of those who died before 1947. She was an archivist at the Royal Society for Asian Affairs for 10 years and was a council member of the Royal Asiatic Society. She was awarded an MBE, that is Member of the Order of the British Empire, in 2015 for services to the British Association of Cemeteries in South Asia and the British India Studies. Thank you, Rosie, for accepting our invitation and sparing the time. Welcome. So following Rosie's talk that is expected to last approximately 45 minutes, we will open the session for questions. Meanwhile, if you want, you are welcome to write your questions in the chat box and we'll take them as sequentially as they come. So thank you all for joining once again. Over to you, Rosie.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sanal, for your welcome and also for the opportunity to lecture to the students. What I'm going to do is to show a series of PowerPoint images and I'm going to talk through them. We'll have questions afterwards rather than during the lecture. And I'm interested in the idea of a palimpsest because this is something you normally start peeling away from the top layer. But here we're actually going to build up from the earliest things we know about Lucknow. So it's a kind of palimpsest in reverse, if you like. If we could have the first slide, please. Next, please. So here we are. Now, it was thought for quite a long time, certainly by British historians, that Lucknow was simply a series of villages along the river Gumpti. There was no idea that it was a medieval city. And it's only perhaps within the last half a century that people have realized that Lucknow was an important place. I'm not going into its earliest origins because I don't actually know anything about it, I'll be frank. But what I wanted to do was to start with the idea of a medieval city. Unusually, it's not walled, so it's not like Delhi. It's never been a walled city. What it does have is a chowk, a marketplace, and a fort. and by the side of the River Gumti. So it's a fairly important place, and certainly on a trading route. We believe that it might have had its own mint at some point. So it's a fairly important medieval city. It's small. So I'm starting off with the Akbari Gate. This is the southern gate of the Chowk. The northern gate, the Gol Darwaza, was introduced later on, but obviously this is 17th century from its name. And this is what it looks like. It's a mess. It's what you would expect. It's very much like Chandni Chowk in Delhi, covered with wires and extruded buildings, people's washing, and all kinds of things. But nevertheless, it is important because it centers us in old Lucknow. Next, please. I mentioned the fort, and it's known now as the Machi Bawan Fort, and I'll explain in a minute where we get the Machi bit from. We don't know its earlier name, so I'm simply going to refer to it in medieval terms as the fort. And it stands on the River Gumti, and to the right of this picture, you can see the Aurangzeb Mosque. And this was actually built on the site of an earlier Hindu temple. So we're unfortunately referring to a kind of Ayodhya situation here. Nevertheless, there's the mosque, built sometime about 1700. And the fort there, imposing, very imposing indeed. And in the center, you can see a slightly lower area, which is the gateway into the fort. And we'll talk about the Machi bit now. When the earliest Nawabs came from Naishapur in Iran to India, they were appointed as governors to the Subadar, to the Suba of Awadh. And at this point, they were obviously appointed by the Mughal emperors, by Aurangzeb and his successors. And they were feeling their way. They were immigrants, but with the sort of vigor of new immigrants, they were prepared to take on a lot. And one of their awards from the Mughal emperor was what is called the Maha Maratib. And this is a symbol of two fishes hanging down from a pole. If you can imagine, we see it in some of the old Mughal manuscripts. It's two silver fishes suspended on a pole. And it's very, very prestigious. So you can imagine that the first Nawab, Burhanul Mulk, was really, really pleased to get this award. In fact, he was so pleased that the fish actually became quite ubiquitous in Lucknow. And we'll see this later on some of the buildings, the fish emblem. So wherever you see two fish, you're thinking of Lucknow and you're thinking of Awadh. So it was natural that the fort, which, as I say, we don't know its original name, probably just called the Kila, became the Machi Bawan, the fish house. This has puzzled a lot of people for a long time, but this is where it comes from. It comes from that award given to the first Nawab by the Mughal emperor, and something to be very proud of. And in fact, we see this right down to the last Nawab, and it's even on coins and book plates. It's ubiquitous. So what I think you've got the idea of now is a fort, a strong fort by the River Gumti, which is navigable, so ships are trading up and down, and the market, the Chowk, very, very nearby. So I suppose your typical medieval city, apart from not being walled. Next, please. And I want to talk in some detail about this. It looks a bit strange at first. Let's start with the bottom image first, because this is more conventional. This is a representation of the Machi Bawan, but it's actually before the Nawabs took over. This was done about 1765 by Joseph Tiefenthaler, who was a Jesuit missionary, but also, like many Jesuits, a spy. And it was part of his remit to travel around Awadh and Bengal, drawing as he went. He may have employed Indian draftsmen we don't know, but I very much like the vigor of these pictures, and they're quite numerous. If you look up Tiefenthaler, you'll get an idea of his work and where he traveled. So the bottom picture shows us the fort. To the extreme right, you can see the beginning of the great gateway that led into the fort. And towards the end, you will see little pavilions. It's a smaller area, sort of tails off. Obviously, the fort is on a hill, but now we're going down to the riverbank, and you can see the direction the Gumti is flowing, and there's an arrow pointing left, and it's simply labeled Gumati. All right, that's fairly simple to take in. But if you look at the top picture, this is much more interesting, because we're not used to seeing Lucknow this way round. We're normally seeing the north at the top, obviously, in sort of conventional maps. This looks odd to us because it's the wrong way round in our perception of maps. But on the other hand, it's exactly reproducing what we see in the bottom picture. And I don't need to tell you that maps can be interpreted in all kinds of ways. So if we look at the top map, you can see in the middle and turned oddly on its side are the gateways to the big Machibawan fort. And you can see the fort center. You can also see the largest building was the Panch Mahala, the 5 palaces. And then it sort of tails off. You can see the Gumti, and again, the arrow is pointing the right way, so that's correct. And you can also see the Aurangzeb Mosque just beyond the gateway. So that's absolutely accurate. What's also interesting is as you go further right to the picture, you can see a huge complex. We don't know anything at all about this, but we do know that this is where the Husainabad Imam Barra complex was later built. So I think what we're looking at in a way is a kind of palimpsest of medieval Lucknow before the Nawabi buildings are imposed on it. And if we look at what would be conventionally the northern bank at the bottom of the picture, you can see that there are fairly substantial buildings there, which is interesting because a lot of people thought development only took place on the south bank of the river. In fact, I think there was probably quite a lot on the north bank too. So having got your head around that, bear in mind the bottom image, and we're going to see how the city expands. So we're looking at the city now, mid-18th century. It's obviously 1775 when Nawabi Lucknow started to develop, but I'm going to go back a little before that. Next, please. And the Nawabs, when they were first established in Awadh as governors, in fact, they were Nawab Wazirs, and you probably know that this simply means the deputy of the Mughal emperor. They were his deputies who actually took on a life of their own fairly shortly afterwards. We're looking at a period when the Mughal empire is disintegrating and you're getting a lot of subsidiary little kingdoms starting up, Hyderabad, Bengal, Awadh, and all within the same period, about 1718 to 1724, you get these spin-offs. It's almost as though the empire itself is disintegrating, but it's sending off a series of sparks that are going round and setting up their own little kingdoms. So when the Nawabs first became the governors, if you like, of Awadh, they set up at Faizabad. I have to be honest and say I've not really researched the history of Faizabad, but I am interested because I think there are clear links, and this is one of them. This could perhaps be part of the Machibawan in Lucknow. It isn't, but I think you can see why the Nawabs became attracted to Lucknow, because in a way it's the same kind of situation. This is the River Gogra, and there's a fort on the riverbank, and somewhere else there's going to be a choke. So in a way, Lucknow was quite an attractive and almost familiar situation for them, if you like. This drawing was done about 1780, and by this point, the Nawabs have been installed in Lucknow for about 5 years. obviously there was quite a shift when they moved the capital to Lucknow. It meant the administrative offices had to move, the traders had to move, and fairly quickly, Faizabad became not exactly deserted, but a ghost city, if you like, because the center of power had gone. So when this was drawn by an English artist, William Hodges, in 1780, you can see what's happening. Bits are starting to fall into the river, and there are bushes growing out of the tops of the buildings. So you know that's absolutely going to ruin them. So it's sad. We're saying goodbye to Faizabad, but we're saying hello to Lucknow. Next, please. I haven't got that many pictures of people, but I wanted to put this in because this is Shuja-ud-Dowlah, and he was the last Nawab to live in Faizabad. It was his son, Asaf-ud-Dowlah, who moved to Lucknow. Shuja-ud-Dowlah is the tall man in the center, a good ruler, a sensible man trying to break free from the Mughal Empire. Now, to his immediate left, the rather plump person, also in a fur hat, is Asaf-ud-Dowlah. And he is the one who moves the capital to Lucknow. It's said he moved to get away from the influence of his mother, which I think will be a familiar story to many of us. But if you go along to the left, and the fourth person to the left is quite a tall man. He's wearing a blue coat and he's got a black hat on. And this is Sadat Ali Khan, and he was to succeed his brother, Asaf-ud-Dowlah. So you've got the line of succession. I'm not going to talk that much about the Nawabs because this isn't really about the Nawabs, but I want you to have a picture of what these people look like. And while we're here, I'll just say something about the artist in the bottom left-hand corner. This is a fascinating picture because it is a picture of an English artist painting the Nawabs, but behind the English artist is another Indian artist. So there are three rows of people. The Indian artist who's painted this, the English artist who's painting them, and the subjects. And the artist sitting in the left-hand side, I'm very fond of him. He's called Tilly Kettle. And what I really like about him, those thick, thick spectacles. And you can imagine if he'd been born 2 or 3 centuries later, he would be a real computer geek. He'd be bent over his computer like that. It's the only picture we've got of him. He's sitting on a Western type chair and he's painting away. But I'm actually very, very, very fond of this painting. And it gives you a little bit of background. It's a palace in Faizabad. Next, please. Now, when the Nawabs, when Asaf-ud-Dowlah moved to Lucknow, he obviously wanted to make an impact, and he did. He was an extremely rich man. The money came from land revenue because Lucknow and Awadh is a particularly rich area. It's in the Gangetic Plain. It's very, very fertile, and there's a very good collection of, a way of gathering in the land revenues. So practically all their money came from the land. It came from the zamindars and the riots, the people who were tilling the land. And it meant that the Nawabs had almost unlimited wealth. And my goodness, did they spend it. Now, Asaf-ud-Dowlah was a Shia, like the majority of his family. What he wanted to do was to make Lucknow the center of Shiism in India. And he did this by maqbaras and things associated, obviously not just with the Shia religion, but with Islam in general. This is the Barra Imam Barra. And although I could show you better images, this I think captures some of the actually large expanse that it covers. It's huge. It really is huge, which is why it's called Barra, obviously. To the right-hand side, you can see the Jama Masjid, the big mosque, and then you've got these intricate 3 courtyards where you go in. And an Imam Barra, I'm sure you're familiar with the idea, it can be a maqbara, it can be a place of burial. And in fact, this is. but it's also a place where you gather during Muharram, where you store the tazias, and it's a place of immense decoration, chandeliers, mirrors, anything that is alight and glittering. It's a hugely attractive place. And luckily, the great Imam Barra has survived more or less intact in Lucknow. When you go into the main courtyard, the gate of the Imam Barra is answered on the other side of the road by the Jawab, the answer. And to the other side is the Rumi Darwaza, which we will see in a minute. So here you are, it's absolutely enormous. And this was completed in about 1784. It very, very quickly became the center for Shia pilgrims throughout most of northern India, quite possibly the south too. And it still is today. So I always tell tourists when I'm taking tour groups of foreigners, you take off your shoes, you wear modest dress, and you respect it as an active place of worship today. And when you stand outside, you can see all the pilgrim buses coming in. So it's very much a living memorial. It's not static, it's not dead. It's a working memorial. Next, please. Now, apart from religious buildings, Asaf-ud-Daulah was a great builder himself. He started off in the Muchi Bhawan fort because that was really the largest and most secure place. So his palace was there. He took over the Panch Mahala that we saw, and then he started building around it. And his mother said he's absolutely ruined it. This was one of the reasons why he didn't get on with his mother. She continually criticized him. Right, he's Nawab, but one of the richest provinces in India, but she's still harping away in the background. She says he completely ruined the old Muchi Bhawan. So he starts to build a series of palaces outside the fort. And this is known as the Daulat Khana Palace. This particular building is called the Sheesh Mahal, but I actually think that's a misnomer. The Sheesh Mahal was a smaller palace, obviously from its name, covered in looking glass and mirrors. But nevertheless, people today call this the Sheesh Mahal. So that's what I'm calling it. And it's a building within the Daulat Khana complex, if you like. You've got to see all of these palaces as complexes. It's not just a single building. It contains all kinds of things, the treasury and the stables and the barracks. So this is just one building within a palace complex, and we'll see that later on. I'm sorry to say that you won't see this view today. I took this photograph in 1976 when I was researching for my book, and very sadly it's been encroached. Divisions are down the garden. There are sort of dividing walls. It's a real mess. And in fact, it was pretty much of a mess when I saw it in the 1970s, but nevertheless, the facade was whole then. It isn't now. Next, please. This will be familiar, I think, to many of you. It's La Martiniere College. It's probably one of my favorite buildings in India. And the reason it's here, sort of jumping into Asaf-ud-Daulah's palace, is that it was extremely influential. And Claude Martin, Major General Claude Martin, who built it, was a contemporary of Asaf-ud-Daulah. And to some extent, these people, unlikely as it seems, were rivals in collecting and building. We know now about Asaf-ud-Daulah's heritage. We now also know about Claude Martin, who was born a fairly humble background in Lyon in southern France in 1735. And as a young man, a very young man, he'd actually been apprenticed to a silk weaver because Lyon was famous for its silk weaving, and in fact still is today. I bought a very nice piece of silk there not that long ago. But anyway, this is a bit boring for Martin, who's a really adventurous young boy. So when he gets a chance to join the French East India Company's army, he does. He signs up. He's only 16. he wants to take his younger brother along too, but his stepmother simply won't have this. So Martin goes off by himself. And he arrives in Pondicherry in, I think, 1753, about then. And he works as a dragoon, he's a cavalry officer. He gradually, because he's obviously a very, very bright person, he works his way up and becomes a bodyguard to the French commandant, Lally. But things go wrong, and the French are besieged in Pondicherry by the English East India Company, because they're great rivals, the French and the English. And Martin decides to desert. So he leaves the French company's army and he crosses to the English company's army, where he's accepted and sent on various missions. And I won't go into the whole of his history, just to say that he ended up probably the richest European in late 18th century India, an immensely wealthy man, unlike the Nawab, not from land revenue, but from business enterprises, growing and exporting indigo, money lending, which was a huge source of income for him, property. He built an enormous number of properties and owned huge amounts of land, not only in Lucknow, but in Chandernagore and in Calcutta as well. And this is now his burial place, though it didn't start off like that. Its original name was Constancia. It was to be a giant Freemasons' lodge, if you like, because Martin was a Freemason, and this gave him entree into the upper circles of the company, its officers and its armies. It wasn't completed at the time of his death in 1800, but he'd left instructions for it to be completed. And it was just amazingly influential. You can just make out some of these statues along the parapets and the top. And these were copied for the next 50 years in Nawabi, Lucknow. The arch at the top was copied in the Kaiser Palace. In fact, there are lots of elements of copying in Nawabi architecture. And the lat or tall pillar to the side is actually designed by the same man who designed the Octoloni monument in Calcutta, now the Shahid, I think it's the Shahid Minar in Calcutta. And this was put up after Martin's death, and it's a kind of commemorative pillar. So when we talk about La Martiniere, which is now a college, think of the architecture and its influence on later Lucknow building. Next, please. Martin's previous house, before he built La Martiniere, was called the Chateau de Leon, obviously Leon from his hometown. And it's here towards the left of the picture. You can see the two turrets at the top. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, almost 5 stories with little flags at the top. And it stands on the river Gumti. The Gumti was much more important, much more used than it is today. When you get to Lucknow, you'll just stand on the bank and the river looks a long way off and it looks quite insignificant. But in fact, it was the main waterway. Roads were not particularly good at this period. So you would take a boat to go up and down, to pass through east to west in Lucknow. And you will see that Martin's building, the chateau, is actually built in the water. And this was for, in a way, to cool the building down. And as the river sunk during the monsoon, so Martin would move down into the 2 lower stories. During the monsoon, obviously, the river rose up, and so he himself would rise into another story and then have the whole thing cleaned out after the monsoon to start again the next year. And I hope when you go to Lucknow, you'll actually walk around the back of this building, because there's been a huge amount of archaeological digging there, and they've actually dug it out so you can see the basements. It's one of the most exciting things ever, because I kept telling people there were 2 basement stories there, and they didn't really believe me because the bottom one was flooded and inaccessible. But now they've actually dug it out, so I feel justified. And if you go along just off the right, you can see a squarish building there with red windows. They're not exactly windows, they're shutters, and a little construction on top. This is the British Residency. We're going to look at that in a bit more detail. So here we are, a view you can't actually see these days, although the chateau, luckily, is still there, and so's most of the Residency. Next, please. And here we are, here's the Residency, and it's recognizable just by that little pavilion on top. Now, this was painted by the Indian artist Sitara Ram in 1814. And what I like about it is it's a Palladian villa. It's an English villa. It's plonked down in the middle of Lucknow, and it's not going to work for all kinds of reasons, as I'll show you. Just have a look at the little tiny kiosk on the extreme right, because this is still in place. So we can actually position exactly where the artist was sitting from this little kiosk, which is still there. So this is what it looked like. It's a plain square building, and the entrance is at the first floor level. Next, please. And here we are much later, and you can see what's happened. People have realized you can't actually plonk down a Palladian building in the middle of North India. It's going to be far too hot for one thing. So the original Residency has sprouted all kinds of verandas and shades, and it's got a slightly more defensive tower, no more the little kiosk on top. It's actually got a defensive tower there. And this is where the British resident lived. But when we say Residency, we're looking at the whole of the area, and it's a huge area. It really is very large indeed. It's between 33 and 37 acres, and it contains all kinds of things, including, interestingly enough, a Muslim shrine, which was there before the British started building. It's in ruins for obvious reasons. It was the epicenter of the Uprising of 1857. So it doesn't look like this any longer, but I wanted to show you how impractical it was to try and recreate an English villa in India. It simply wouldn't work. So this is how it was, more or less, before the Uprising. Next, please. And just one more example of how you can't put an English building in India, the Dilkusha Palace. This is in ruins. Again, you'll be able to visit it, but it doesn't look anything like this. Now, this is interesting because it's a straight copy of an English country house at Seaton Delaval in Northumberland. And to the left-hand side, you've got the stable block, and the right-hand side, the kitchen block, or maybe the other way around. But basically, you've got two separate blocks for two different functions. You've got the main building in the middle, and here again, it's a sort of straight Palladian building. It's fairly simple. It's got a triangular pediment at the top, and it stands in a deer park, which is why you've got the deer running around. It was a huge, huge area. So here it is, and the same artist, Sitara Ram, painted it in 1814. Next, please. And this is what happens. So it's lost its pedimented structure at the top. But what's also interesting is that the towers, which were fairly plain, two-story towers, they've suddenly sprouted kiosks and these amazing sort of almost pineapple-like turrets at the top. And they were made out of green pottery. It's quite extraordinary. So what you've done is to Indianize a Western building. This never really worked because it had no central courtyard. There was no place for the women of the palace to go. So it was used mainly as a sort of place for a picnic, a day's hunting. You'd go down there, you'd make yourself comfortable in the rooms, and you'd kill a lot of deer, that kind of thing. But it didn't really work as a palace. It wasn't suitable. And as I say, you can't really plonk an English house down in the middle of India. Unfortunately, it was destroyed after the uprising. We don't know when or why, but it's still quite a magnificent building in its ruined state. Next, please. Sadat Ali Khan, whom we saw in that early picture of Shujurdola and his sons, was perhaps one of the most innovative of the Nawabs. He was cultured, he was artistic, and he spent about 20 years in exile in Benares and Calcutta. Calcutta at that point was obviously very much a westernized city, the city of palaces, if you like, with amazing buildings and wide streets. And Sadat Ali Khan was very, very influenced by what he saw in Calcutta. When he came to Lucknow, he followed his brother as Nawab. He decided to introduce a main processional route, if you like, in Lucknow. So we're moving away from the idea of the small, crowded chowk, the marketplace, into something much, much grander. And it's called Ghazrat Gunge. And it was built about 1810. This is slightly later. It's a very, very broad street. It still is a broad street today. And what was interesting was that it was the central portion was actually closed by two gates. You can see one of the gates in the left hand, and they are described as being Grecian on one side and Islamic on the other. This looks as though it's the Grecian side, but here are the two gates, and in the middle are the palaces of Sadat Ali Khan's sons, the royal area, if you like. It's a new area. It's moved away from the idea that your palace is in the fort into something much grander and much more Europeanized, but with a sensible idea of adapting European buildings for the Indian climate, unlike the British. And this is a procession. This is during the time of Ghaziuddin Haider. It's not a very, very good reproduction, but I wanted to show it to you because it is so lively. There's so much going on there. You can see people on the rooftops. You can see women unveiled, enjoying themselves, waving, the horses, the soldiers and everything. And also you can see that it's sort of joined up. You can see those joins along the top. If you look at the sky, it actually looks as though it's been done in sections, and the joins aren't that good, but nevertheless, it gives you an idea of the liveliness of this place, the processions and the ceremonies and the richness of Lucknow at its peak. Next, please. And we don't often hear about poverty in Lucknow during the Nawabi period, but in fact, there were a large number of poor people. There was a hospital for the poor endowed by the king, but we don't often get to see poor people represented in pictures of Lucknow, which is why I put this one in. If you look at the foreground, you can see people are supplementing towards the Nawab. It's Nasruddin Haider is the person in the middle with the crown, and he's being escorted through the Chateau Manzil Palace by the British resident and the resident's assistant. And I think this was probably after Nasruddin Haider had been crowned as king. This was actually something that the company bestowed on the Nawabs. They said, would you like to be king? And they asked several of these provinces, independent states, if the rulers wanted to be king. And only Awadh said, yes, please. So the king was crowned, and he's now being walked, if you like, through Lucknow, being shown off to the people. And obviously not just the rich people we see in the background and on horseback, but the very poor. And the idea was that people on horseback would throw coins down for the poor people. They'd scrabble on the ground. I mean, just how degrading, and occasionally get trampled underfoot. So we've got to remember that in spite of all of the glitter and the glamour, there was poverty here. There's absolutely no doubt about it. These are poor townspeople. There was rural poverty too. This is the Chateau. This was one of the palace complexes developed by Sadat Ali Khan. It was magnificent. You can see why it's called Chateau, because it's got the brass umbrellas at the top. It sadly doesn't look much like this today, but there is a program of restoration. It was magnificent, and it stood on the banks of the Gumti. It was just next to Claude Martin's Chateau de Leon. Next, please. This is the last palace. This is the Kaiser Palace, and it was built by the last king, if you like, Wajid Ali Shah. Again, you won't see very much of this left. You will see the white Baradari in the center, which is now very popular as a marriage hall. And to the left, you'll see a small canal with a fairly degraded bridge over it. You'll see the great gateways at the bottom of the picture and the top of the picture. These are the Kaiser gateways, but a lot of the terraces have gone. To the right-hand side, just inside the walls, you can see an odd structure called the Lanka or bridge. But why I put this in, quite apart from the architecture, is that this was a scene of all kinds of amazing theatricals. Wajid Ali Shah was a very talented man. He was a playwright, a musician, a poet, and also a director of incredible events, musicals, if you like. And these would take a very long time to play through. It was said that one scene a night, so a play could last for about 6 weeks with just one scene a night. And to some extent, Kaiserbach was a giant stage set. British critics derided the architecture. They said, oh, it's too theatrical. It looks like Vauxhall, you know, it's a theatre set. In fact, not realizing this was exactly what Wajid Ali Shah had intended. It's not only a palace, it's an amazing stage, if you like. And there were all kinds of things going on. The king is actually being led in procession. And, you know, it's a very, very vivid picture. Unfortunately, as I said, it doesn't look anything like this today. What you will see when you get there are the two gateways, the traffic hurtling through it, the white Baradari there, and the canal. And that's really all that remains. The rest is just gardens. Next, please. This was just one of the gateways in the Kaiserbach. It's the Mermaid Gateway. And you can see how the idea of the fish, the Muchli, from the old Mughal award, have actually morphed into mermaids. I suppose it's a natural transgression. If you want to have bigger and bigger fish, at some point they're going to turn into mermaids. And this is what happened. You can actually see through the next arch, the more conventional fish up like that. But here we've got mermaids. And it was just extremely imaginative. It was whimsical, if you like, a sort of folly. It was brightly colored, quite extraordinary. This is the only image we've got of it. The whole thing was destroyed. Next, please. I didn't put this map in at the beginning because it deals specifically with the uprising, but it's quite a good representation of where we are. So I'll just talk you through it. Now, conventionally, we have the north at the top of the picture. So some of those little buildings we looked at are on the north bank of the Gumti. So the River Gumti is running right through, and it's obviously Gumti because it's a winding river. Now, to the south, coming down, we've got the Hyder Canal. This was built by Nasruddin Hyder, more or less at British prompting. The idea was that eventually it would join up with the Ganges, but in fact it didn't. So you've got the river there and the canal to the south. You've got Ghazrat Gunge, the main street I was talking about, going straight up through the center of the map. You've got the British Residency to the left-hand side. You've got the Kaiserbach Palace. I'm not sure if you can actually see it, but that's where it was. You've got gardens. Oh, thank you very much. That's helpful. So you've got the Kaiser Park there, and the British Residency further up that I showed you earlier on, and various country houses. You've got La Martiniere way over here on the right-hand side with, thank you, with the lake in front of it, and the Dilkusha is somewhere, it's somewhere down there. So there you are, the development mainly on the southern bank, but with a lot of gardens, as you can see. What's interesting is that the portion below the palaces, the named palaces, city of Lucknow, this was referred to by the British as dense city. And that's because they didn't really like to sort of penetrate through it. It was more or less, as you can imagine, like the choke. It was very, very densely packed. Old areas, including Ghazrat Gunge, where the original arsenal was, but this was somewhere where the British didn't go. And it's interesting that during the uprising of 1857, 1858, all of the fighting actually took place in the newer part of Lucknow, along Ghazrat Gunge, across the river, around the Residency. Very, very little happened in the old city. It wasn't really penetrable. So that doesn't really figure in stories of the uprising. But I think this gives you an idea of how it was laid out. Next, please. And Kaiser Palace. So we've now gone through the uprising. And one of the things that the British did, and this has always interested me a lot, it was really the annexation of Awadh that I think had a lot to do with causing the uprising. All right, there were other causes. I mean, the Mughal emperor was just confined to the Red Fort in Delhi. He had a lot of grievances. So did the Rani of Jhansi. So did other people. But I think it was really the company seizing Awadh, the rich kingdom of Awadh, annexing it. And Wajid Ali Shah goes off to Calcutta. He's not exiled, he goes to Calcutta anyway. And within a year, the uprising had broken out. And I don't want to go in detail into this, but to look at the effects in Lucknow. And the effects were that the British took revenge on the buildings of Lucknow, on the palaces of Lucknow. They said they were constructed by decadent rulers, and particularly the Kaiser Park, because this was the headquarters of Begum Hazrat Mahal, who was leading the fight against the British in Lucknow. And this was a particular area of vengeance, which is why there's so little left, because the British deliberately destroyed a lot of it. They blew up some of the terraces. They put roads right through the middle, which is why you've got that road going between the two Kaiser Park gates, which is an enormous main road today. And all of this portion here, the Lanka, which was used as a giant stage set, has gone completely. You can imagine how theatricals would have taken place here in the round, with the actors and singers and dancers coming out between those pavilions and the audience all around the outside. But that was then, this is now. If you look to the extreme left-hand side, you'll see two tall wooden structures which look at first glance as though they might be giant swings. They're not, they're gallows. This is where a lot of the, what should I call them, not exactly rebels, although rebelling against English rule. This is where people who opposed the British were hung. And the idea was deliberate, that where company soldiers had been killed, shot down, this is where the gallows would be erected. This is where Indians would be hung, more or less at the scene of their crimes, if you like. Obviously, a lot of innocent men were hung, but I always think how ironic. This was a garden of pleasure for a comparatively short time, and then it turned into a place of execution. So I can't really enjoy looking at this photograph without thinking of the gallows to the left-hand side. Next, please. And this is the Cawnpore Road after the British had come back in March 1858 and they'd captured the city. The 2 weeks of very, very fierce fighting. There was enormous resistance put up, huge resistance by the town people, enormous barricades built around because the city was not walled. They had to put up earthen barricades. In the end, the British, who were accompanied by the Gurkhas from Nepal, actually had superior firepower. They pulverized the buildings. They had a much larger army. They just had better weaponry, if you like. But this is interesting because what it shows is the electric telegraph has been re-erected. This was one of the vital communication points, and it was one of the first things that the rebel sepoys cut when they took over Lucknow and started besieging the Residency. The first thing to go was the telegraph, and this meant that the British, holed up in the Residency, couldn't communicate with Cawnpore or Calcutta. They were really cut off. So one of the first things they did as soon as the British reconquered the city was to re-erect the telegraph, which is a wooden or bamboo pole, and you simply got copper wire going along to the next pole. And to the bottom left-hand side, you can see a deserted, you can see discarded shell, and you can see how the buildings were absolutely pulverized like this. Next, please. Neat and tidy, and this is what the British did. And in fact, William Russell, who was one of the reporters just after the uprising, came back 20 years later. He was accompanying the Prince of Wales on a visit, and he said, he knew Lucknow well, obviously. When he saw it again 20 years later, he was appalled. He said, Lucknow has been fairly tidied off the face of the earth. And this is indeed what had happened. We're seeing here the Chateau Manzil that I showed you in an earlier painting. And it was surrounded by other buildings, by little courts, by mosques, by little palaces, by other buildings. They've all been swept away. And there are the tents of the British occupying force in the middle ground where there were buildings. They were just cleared away. And somebody else said the British like grass better than bazaars. They just swept everything away, obviously for military reasons, because you're not going to have people sort of hiding in little passages and congested streets. But this is what it looks like. It's all neat and clean and tidy. And one of the things the British did do, quite apart from putting the roads through the palace complexes, demolishing buildings out of spite, was to introduce a series of military roads going through the old city, what the British called the dense city. So you've got 3 huge roads going through, one of which was called Victoria Street, after Queen Victoria. And they're punching their way through these congested neighborhoods. So you'll see little pockets of very, very congested areas, if you like, and then you suddenly come to a very broad road. And this was exactly what the British were planning, pushing through their roads. And it was indeed very neat and tidy for a very long time. The Chateau Manzil was actually turned into the United Services Club. So you've got the British sitting on the terraces overlooking the river, gin and tonic in hand, where the Nawabs had lived. Doesn't look like this today, I have to say. It's a bit more untidy, but nevertheless, you know, this is the British ideal. It's all neat and tidy, and it's all whitewashed. Next, please. Now I'm moving on to more recent Lucknow. I have to say that my strength is really in the Nawabi period, but I want to try and bring you up to date. This is Butler Palace, and this has a very sad history, almost as sad as some of the Nawabi buildings, and in a way sadder because it's been much more politicized. It was built by the Raja of Mahmudabad in, I think about probably before 1915. And it was built for Sir Harcourt Butler, who was the governor of Ovid at the time. Mahmudabad and Butler were very good mates, really good friends indeed. So the Raja, having led the uprising against the British, is suddenly rehabilitated as a very, very large talukadar, quite a rich man actually. And he builds this palace for his friend, the governor, Sir Harcourt Butler. But because the current Raja's father opted for Pakistan at the time of partition, this was actually seized as enemy property. And the current Raja spent most of his life trying to get it back. And for one glorious moment in 2010, he did, but then it was seized again. And sadly, plans to turn it into a hotel have just been scuppered. This is more or less what it's like today. It's a really interesting building inside. You may be able to get inside if you can talk to the right people, but it's very much a political pawn. Next, please. Do you remember the picture I showed you of Ghazrat Gunge with the procession sort of going down through all these sort of marvelous, intricate gateways? Well, I'm afraid this is what it looked like in the 1920s. It's just been turned into a conventional shopping area. All right, it's got things like the railway border there on the left-hand side, but basically it's a shopping centre, which it is today. It's much more congested today, but you know, it's a conventional street. It could be anywhere. Next, please. And this is the council chamber. Politically, Lucknow had been the capital of Lucknow. The capital then shifted to Allahabad, but it shifted back to Lucknow, I think around the 1920s. So a council chamber was built and it's actually being put up here. It's now, of course, the state capital. Next, please. And Lucknow, if you looked at it in the sort of early 20th century, it's a place of education. Obviously, Lucknow University is there. This is interesting. This was the college for the talukadars, for the sons of the landowners who the British were trying to woo after 1858 because they realized how powerful these landowners were. It was the governor, I think John Colvin, founded this, but it's equivalent to Mayo College, if you like, which was a college for the princes, the sons of princes. And in what is today Pakistan, Aitchison College fulfilled the same function. So this was a college for the talukadars. And Lucknow is full of many, many good educational institutions, very much a place of education. You go to Lucknow to be educated. Next, please. This is King George Medical College. They did attempt to change the name into, was it Chhatrapati Shivaji College? And the old students simply wouldn't have it. They said, we're proud of coming from King George's Medical College. We're George, and this is what we're going to stay. So it's actually still called that now. I think originally it was King George and Queen Mary Medical College. And interestingly, this is actually built on the site of the old Machi Bhawan. Nobody has excavated under it. I think if they did, they'd find all kinds of interesting things from the medieval fort. But anyway, here's the college sitting on top there. Next, please. And we're coming right up to the modern period. Gumti Nagar is where Lucknow started to develop in the 80s and the 90s. And the Taj Hotel, which I think is called the Vivanta Hotel or the Residency Hotel, something like that, was the first building to be put up in Gumti Nagar. And I actually remember going there when it just stood alone in the middle of fields. The area is hugely developed today. But what's also interesting, it's a very nice hotel, but if you look at that dome, it's sort of somehow going back to the Nawabi period, almost to the Chateau Manzil with its brass domes. Next, please. And this is Ambedkar Park. We're coming right up to date to the time of Mayawati, who instigated a huge building plan just outside Lucknow. It's in commemoration of Dr. Ambedkar. And it's vast. It's absolutely vast. I can't tell you how big it is. It's much the biggest complex anywhere in Lucknow. I'm not over fond of it because I think the money could have been better spent in improving infrastructure in Lucknow itself. And also it's this un-Lucknow color of pink sandstone. It really doesn't meld with the Lucknow buildings, which are made out of Lakori brick and stuccoed over. So I almost see this as another Lucknow. It's something outside the city. You can't avoid it because you have to go through it when you're coming from the airport. But I would be interested to know what you think when you see it. Ambedkar Park, huge, huge complex. Next, please. And this is the last slide. It's not terribly clear, but you get the message. Work in progress, Lucknow Metro. And the Metro has transformed Lucknow, not necessarily for the better. There was a huge dispute and arguments about whether the Metro should be underground in Ghazrat Gunge, and in fact, it is. This is part of Ghazrat Gunge, and it does go underground, but it immediately sort of jumps up afterwards, after it's passed through the sort of main bit of Ghazrat Gunge. And so roads which were broad and tree-lined, comparatively quiet, like the University Road, now have these gigantic concrete columns going through them with the Metro running above. All right, I know it's convenient for people, but I was talking on Monday to a friend of mine and he said, well, I still prefer to take an auto rick because they'll be door to door and it's cheaper. So we'll see, but I'm not going to knock it. Progress happens. I'm just sorry that more of the Metro wasn't underground, which I thought was going to be initially, but it isn't. It's there. It's in your face. Last slide, please. And there you are. So you can see this. You can see the Gumti, the broad Gumti, various little buildings, new rise. Not exactly skyscrapers in the center of Lucknow, but it's very, very different. Last slide, please. Next, please. And this is my book. I haven't talked much about the military aspect of Lucknow, apart from the military roads being sort of punched through the city. But I know you're going to visit the cantonment. And this was something that the British established after 1857. The cantonment had initially been quite a long way outside Lucknow. It had been 4 miles north, but the British needed it much nearer. They were obviously nervous about a new uprising taking place. So they moved it to the south around the Dilkusha area. And it's a very, very pleasant place. But what was interesting, when I was asked to do this book for HarperCollins, though I know the city well, I'd never actually looked at it from a military point of view, which I had to do. And I had to get a retired brigadier to explain to me all these military terms like picket and redan, and to look at mid-19th century weaponry. It was fascinating. I really enjoyed doing it. So this is my latest work. Well, I've said quite enough now, so I'm going to keep quiet and ask you to give me questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. It was absolutely fascinating. So yeah, let's invite all the questions. I have a couple, but before we begin, I just want to quickly acknowledge the presence of Professor Tradeep and Professor Gauri. Professor Tradeep is the provost at the CEPT University, and Gauri heads the Architectural and History Theory Department at CEPT University. So I just wanted to acknowledge their presence, and we are open to, hello Tradeep. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for letting us know, Sonal. That was Professor Rosie. That was really enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Oh, good, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
So let's begin with the questions, and maybe I can begin. So Rosie, thank you for the absolutely informative way in which you unpacked all the images and maps. Mostly we have been doing that through our studio, unpacking the maps as we find them. And you did mention in your lecture that specifically in the context of Tiefenthaler's map, that he possibly was also using Indian draftsmen in his work. Was that something that was usual at that time, having Indian draftsmen, and what draftsmen have in the creation of such drawings?
No, that's an interesting question. I've been looking at maps of India, in particular Mughal maps, for another book I'm working on. And there's a huge absence of maps. There really is. All right, there are some of the Kaiser maps when you're looking at some land revenue holdings, but I can't find any maps from the Mughal period. But what I think is, I found one or two little maps, and I think when people were making a journey, they would get somebody just to draft out just little lines on a piece of paper with the towns marked, like Allahabad, Benares, Calcutta. And you do it in stages, obviously, you had to during the 18th century. But you also tend to ask, well, if people were planning military expeditions, how did they know what was there? How did they know which rivers to cross, whether there were roads and that kind of thing? And I can only think that most of it was verbal, simply because we do not have these maps. All right, it's possible they've all been destroyed or eaten by white ants, but I'm sure we would have found some had they existed. But nevertheless, Indian draftsmen did create many of these maps. Tiefenthaler couldn't have drawn everything by himself. And certainly when James Rennell, the geographer of Bengal, was working, he was employing Indian draftsmen. He would employ Europeans. Claude Martin was actually working as a map maker in the north of Bengal, but Martin would have employed Indian draftsmen. We don't yet know the extent. What I can't understand is why the Indian draftsmen weren't producing the maps themselves with their own names on, instead of working for foreigners. And when we look at Susan Golay has written a lot about Mughal maps, but when I looked at them, I found they were just maps that the Frenchman, Gentil, had commissioned. Again, he was using Indian draftsmen, but he commissioned them. It wasn't indigenous. So an interesting question. We're still looking for indigenous maps.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Do we have other questions, students?
Yes. Sonal, sorry, may I just add a question?
Yes. Yes, please.
Thank you. Sorry for just coming in. On the question of maps, there was the map, there was a drawing that you showed with buildings on either side, and you said it was the other way around.
Yes.
Yeah, so is that in any way inspired by the tradition of Islamic maps, which usually showed south up before the north up convention came up?
I don't know. I mean, it's so interesting because the bottom view is conventional. It's someone sitting on the north bank, just drawing what they see across the river. But when you transfer it into map form, it just looks wrong. Well, not wrong, just odd to my eyes. I don't know where that idea came from, or whether it's to do with the flow of the river, where you sat on one bank, and if the river was flowing that way, that was how you drew it. I don't know. But what you might do is to look at some of Tiefenthaler's other maps and see if the same thing applies. He wrote 3 volumes. You can just Google it, and it's the 3rd volume, contains all of the maps of Bengal and Awadh. So have a look at that, and you might be able to extrapolate something from that.
Rosie, I had another question. Sorry, regarding the Daulat Khana that you had showed. We had a chance to visit the Daulat Khana this past visit. I was there. And it's also called the Asafi Koti,
Yes.
which means that, the house of Asaf-ud-Daula. And it's very interesting in the sense that some of the records in the archives says that Asaf-ud-Daula commissioned Charles Marsac, but on the site, the plaque there says that Claude Martin built it. So there is a discrepancy there, but at the same time, the observation that we've come across mostly is that these Nawabs were commissioning their personal projects, like their own palaces and things like that. They were employing Europeans and foreigners to do that, but public projects such as the Imam Barra, the mosques and such, they were primarily having a more indigenous language. Do you see that as a pattern? Do you think there might be a particular reason politically or else or otherwise to such a pattern of building?
Yes, there's no doubt that the Nawabs, starting with Asaf-ud-Daula, were fascinated by the European buildings they saw, including La Martiniere and the Chateau de Leon. And we know they did employ Europeans, certainly with the Dilkusha, that was Sir Gore Ouseley, was commissioned by Sadat Ali Khan to build that, and he simply copied a building from England. The Asafi Koti, I've thought about this. I am not sure if Claude Martin was involved or not. I can't find any written evidence. Charles Marsac might be a likely candidate because we know Asaf-ud-Daula copied a house of his. I haven't found evidence, but if you find anything in the archives, I would be really, really interested. And the Daulat Khana is obviously the generic name, the sort of place of wealth, which it was, but within it, there's the Shish Mahal and the Asafi Koti. So we have to assume that Asaf-ud-Daula did live there at one point.
Yeah, sorry. There is a question in the chat box from Karan Rani. I would invite him to quickly present his question.
Yeah, sure. So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, from the outside, at least based on how the city has been represented in popular culture, largely, Lucknow seems to be a palimpsest of iconic buildings which were made by the city's different rulers over the last 3 centuries or so. At the same time, certain defining instances in the city's history stand out, such as the Lucknow siege. But the painting, which you showed, it showed this gentry that was largely impoverished, and they were sort of at the mercy of the rulers, so to say. So, do you think that the non-elite residents of Lucknow have been largely either underrepresented or completely missing from the city's historical as well as more contemporary narratives? So, do you think that is the case? That the people or the sort of non-elite people of Lucknow are sort of just absent when you sort of look at the city's history?
Yes, I think that's absolutely the case. This was the only painting I could find which actually shows the non-elite people there. And it's interesting that there is another copy of this painting in the Wellcome Museum in London, and it's completely cut out that bottom layer. So all you've got is the king being paraded along in front of the palace by the 2 British, and that's it. So this is why I was so fascinated to find this, the lower level of the painting, if you like. It's the only representation I've seen. And I did search to see if I could find any pictures of the ordinary houses that people lived in, that is, these sort of thatched bungalows. I couldn't find anything clear enough to reproduce. But if we look at some of the pencil-drawn panoramas, particularly by Smith in about 1815, you can see that in front of some of these grandiose brick-built buildings, the humble little mud and thatched cottages. We know very little about poor people in Lucknow. I've written a chapter in one of my books, Engaging Scoundrels, called a poorer class of person. And I'm looking at these sort of hospitals and the poorer people, but I had to work very hard to get information for that. So we simply don't have enough information. Lucknow, as you say, was presented as an amazing, glittering city. We know it couldn't be like that. No city is, but we don't have very much information about the non-elite. You're quite right.
Right. So there is just a small follow-up question about this. So how did the Nawabs build so much and so magnificently, and how did they live so lavishly? In the sense, if the everyday gentry was impoverished, so where did they get the money from to build so much and to live so lavishly? If taxation wasn't the only source of income.
Well, as I said, it was land revenue in an incredibly rich area, which is why the British really wanted to get their hands on it. A huge amount came from land revenue. There was some by customs duties, people coming up the river, and taxes on travellers, but I'm convinced the bulk of the money came from land revenue, and the Nawabs spent incredibly freely, and they're also able, they had so much money, they're able to lend money to the East India Company, which actually didn't pay them back. But just immensely wealthy, unbelievably wealthy, which makes it all the more shameful that we know there was poverty there.
Thanks. Thanks.
Rosie, this Machi Point complex was the site where Asaf-ud-Daula, when he moved his capital to Lucknow, he decided to start building in that complex. At some point, he also was living in that complex. He rented the property. He rented it apparently from the talukadars or the zamindars to live there. He built the Imam Barra, and then he started constructing Daulat Khana and all that all around. Why do you think so? He had to rent, like, you know, given the wealth or something, he could have like come here, established himself with a lot of force and imposed his presence in a more, more impositional manner than coming, like, it seems almost like he wanted to blend in the landscape. That's how I'm reading him wanting to rent and live for the timing until the Daulat Khana bill. So if you have any thoughts, or if you have thought about such that aspect of the Machi Bhavan, it would be great if you can share that with us.
Yes, I can't say very much about that. I mean, moving a capital is a huge enterprise. You're not going to just move into a building and then think you might go back to Faisabad. It was a wholesale movement. It took the whole of 1775 and 1776 to move. And having moved, they couldn't go back. I don't know very much about land tenure before the Nawabs arrived, but there was a group of people called the Sheikhzadas, the sons of the sheikhs, who I think were also the talukadars as well. So it makes sense that new people coming in would rent land from them. I don't know at what point the Nawabs simply took over the land, but I should imagine they did. They bought it, or they simply seized it, or they encroached it. And we have another question here.
Yes, we have a question from Trideep. Trideep, you please present your question.
There's a question from Pranjali. Sorry, do you want me to answer the question in the chat box?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, let's have Pranjali's question first, and then we'll come to you, Trideep. Okay.
So Pranjali said, when military roads were cut through the dense old city, there must have been a certain displacement. Yeah, absolutely. No, we don't know where they were displaced to. And my feeling is that the British just marched through, built these roads, and they didn't really care where people went. You've got to remember that the British were very, very frightened. They believed for a long, long time that there would be another uprising, which is why later buildings tend to look quite defensive. I don't think they really bothered about who they were displacing. They would have blown up some of the old areas by gunpowder. It was pretty nasty. So I'm afraid I can't answer that. Obviously, it did have a huge impact on these neighborhoods. I mean, I'm actually very fond of the old city. I stayed in Ghazrat Gunge for a couple of seasons, and I really enjoyed it. It is so different from the newer part of Lucknow. But I'm sorry, I can't answer that. And I think the only way you'd be able to answer it would be by looking at the records of the British government in the National Archives in Delhi, or if you get the chance to come to London, there must be practical stuff from the PWD, but I haven't gone into that.
Yes, I think there is, that's our hope. And we were talking about the opacity of the archive yesterday, but UP State Archives does have a lot of records about related to PWD construction during the time. But it's just that it's very difficult to access them. But we are hopeful that we are able to put our hands on that in this visit. So let's see, hoping for some luck there.
What would be really useful would be if we had a comprehensive catalogue of what's in the state archives. I've not seen that. I mean, if you go there, there's nothing. We need a catalogue. If anyone wants to take that on, they would have our eternal thanks.
Totally, yes. Yeah, thank you. Through the, yes, please present your question.
Thank you, Professor. That was fascinating. I just want, you did speak about Wajid Ali Shah and the aesthete that he was. Right? I mean, one part of the Lucknow story that we don't really know very much about is the relationship between the Avdi, the Lucknowi cuisine, and the kind of impact that it began to have, or not at all, on the British food habits in Lucknow. They seem, from what one has read, they seem completely untouched by these delicacies which were being churning out from Wajid Ali Shah's kitchen. Is that a right impression? Is it something, or there's no work on it?
Well, that's an interesting question. My feeling is I'm quite a keen cook, and I've got quite a good selection of what I call Anglo-Indian cookery books. I've got Indian cookery books, but I've also got a lot of Anglo-Indian cookery books, which were cookery books written for the Mem Sahib to tell her cook what to cook. And as far as I can tell, the British were fairly conventional, or they might have put a bit of curry powder in one of their dishes. I don't think they enjoyed Indian food, and I'm pretty sure they wouldn't have enjoyed some of the delicacies that Wajid Ali Shah's cooks could prepare. I've not come across any reference to delicious meals. I've come across sarcastic references to the way the tables were laid, supposedly an English table, and the china that was used, but I've not come across any reference to food. But my feeling is the English stuck fairly solidly to their food and their drink, and to some extent still did up to 1947.
Yes, yeah. And not even mangoes, is it?
I've not read descriptions of the English enjoying mangoes. I think I've got one or two recipes for mango puddings, but it's going to be a conventional English pudding with a mango. You don't get descriptions of the English sitting there enjoying mangoes, stuffing them into their mouths. You just don't get
them. and eating them with kebabs as Wajid Ali Shah would.
It's not British.
Yeah.
They missed a lot.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions?
What I can do, so now I can put my email address in the chat box if people think of something. So I'm going to do that right now.
Yes, please. Rosie, I have a lot of questions. Maybe I'm feeling a little, greedy, but I have just one. Maybe I'll just stop after this question. And we were talking about, the eating habits, and also how the Europeans looked down upon the eating habits, or also like whatever the Nawabs were doing. It was a performance when they invited the British to their dinner parties and things like that. It happened during Ghaziuddin, Nasiruddin, and so on. And all these Nawabs used to invite them, and they were invited as a form of a performance that, hey, we are also anglicized to a certain extent. So we find a lot of references in which the Europeans are deriding their culture. And Aina Khana appears as one of the prominent examples of that, which is a collection of curiosities that Asaf-ud-Daula was collecting and displaying. And also he would invite the Europeans there. And Europeans have written a lot of sarcastic comments related to that. I was wondering if you have come across any reference, any visual reference of that building, or any visual reference of the collections in those buildings, or anything apart from the descriptions that the Europeans have been writing.
Yes, I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question. But if we're talking about collections, Asaf-ud-Daula had a large collection of material in the Sheesh Mahal, and this is a building which was in the Daulat Khana complex, but it's been demolished, but there are descriptions of it. And because the descriptions are by Europeans, they're being quite sarcastic. They're saying that Asaf-ud-Daula had, kind of valuable watches, and they'd be put next to a really sort of cheap and vulgar painting, and that he had no discrimination in what he collected. He would just hand out money. And in fact, there are descriptions of Europeans selling him quite trivial things. He seemed very fond of mechanical things, little clockwork mice. Anything that moves seemed to have attracted him. And he spent an awful lot of money on it. In fact, Europeans would go to Lucknow specifically to sell stuff to the Nawab. All right, some of it was good, but a lot of it was trash. So that all seems to have been in the Sheesh Mahal. But what's interesting, when I was talking about Claude Martin and Asaf being almost rivals, so coming from different places, Martin himself had a huge collection of stuff in the Chateau de Leon, and somebody describes it as being like a perfect museum. He had all kinds of things. There would have been like a sort of cabinet of curiosities where you have natural items like shells and pressed flowers. He also had paintings, odd things. Bhutan idols is how he describes them. I've just actually published an inventory from Claude Martin's houses, and that gives some idea of, a huge amount of stuff. So I see him and Asaf almost as rivals in their collections, but Claude Martin possibly a bit more discriminating. And the sad thing is, because Lucknow was looted so comprehensively when the British came back in 1858, there's so little left, really.
Thank you.
Good. Okay, well, people can email me if they have other questions. I put my email address in the chat box. So I'm happy to answer questions.
Yes, all right. Thank you so much, Rosie, for your time and for your scholarship, sharing it with us.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We will be in touch with you to follow up on the logistics for the lecture.
Okay, so I'll say goodbye to everyone and thank you. Thank you for hosting me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.